Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Ever feel like, I don't know, like you're just drowning in expectations? Trying to be that good girl, but inside, you're screaming for something more. Yeah, that's the kind of raw emotion you get diving into Good Girl by Aria Aber. It's a coming-of-age story, but with a real twist. And honestly, it's one of those books that really sticks with you. So hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any of our future deep dives. You can find a link to the book down in the episode description. But let me give you the basic setup. Good Girl throws us into the world of Nyla. She's a young woman struggling with the weight of tradition in the middle of modern-day Berlin. Nyla's the daughter of Afghan refugees, raised in Gropiusstadt, which is, well, it's a pretty stark concrete jungle of an area. And she's caught between these strict honor codes of her family and this, pulsating freedom of the city that's just begging her to break free. We're talking about some deep stuff here. Identity, belonging, and the scars of exile that just echo through generations. The book throws you right into Nyla's internal conflict, immediately. She feels so stifled by the limitations on her as a woman, especially compared to, the freedom that her male cousins have. It's not just typical teenage angst, it's this deep yearning for agency, for the right to define her own life. And that fuels her rebellion. She looks for liberation through art, through these really intense relationships, and unfortunately through some pretty dangerous escapism.
You know what I find so fascinating is how Aber takes Nyla's personal rebellion and connects it to the wider immigrant experience. It's not just about breaking free from family, it's this whole navigation of assimilation, like trying to fit in while still holding on to your cultural heritage. Nyla's struggle to balance these two worlds is like almost a microcosm of what so many immigrants go through, especially those caught between two very different cultures.
That's so true. And Aber is brilliant at showing the deep impact of exile. And not just on Nyla, but on her whole family. Her parents carry so much weight, from being displaced from Afghanistan. They're haunted by trauma, by war, by loss. Their anxieties, their strictness, it's all part of trying to protect Nyla from a world they don't really trust.
And tragically, it ends up creating this cycle of misunderstanding and resentment. Nyla sees her parents' rules as this suffocating thing, while they see her rebellion as rejecting their values, their sacrifices. It really highlights how hard it is to bridge cultural divides, even inside a family connected by love. Aber captures that tension so beautifully.
Absolutely. It's like they're speaking different languages, even though they're both trying to express the same desire for safety and belonging. And speaking of belonging, let's talk about Nyla's relationships. Her romance with Marlowe, this older American writer living in Berlin. It's electric, but it's ultimately toxic. It's fueled by drugs, by shared loneliness, and this need to push boundaries.
What really strikes me about their connection is how it reflects Nyla's own inner turmoil. Marlowe is both an escape and a danger for her. He mirrors her reckless impulses and her self-destructive tendencies. He becomes this catalyst for her to finally confront the darkness she's been trying to keep down.
Exactly. It's like she's drawn to him because he embodies the freedom she craves. But that freedom has a really steep price. And Aber doesn't shy away from showing the violence that weaves through Nyla's life.
That's one of the most powerful parts of the book, for sure. Aber intertwines these different kinds of violence. She highlights how connected personal trauma is to these larger societal issues. You have the physical violence in Nyla's relationship with Marlowe, which echoes the abuse she saw as a child.
And then there's that societal violence, the racism, the xenophobia. Aber makes it so real through the presence of these neo-Nazi groups in Berlin. These threats directly impact Nyla's family, her community. It shatters any illusion of safety or escape.
Exactly. And then there's this quieter, more insidious violence, the internalized violence. It's Nyla's self-destructive behaviors and the emotional scars from her past. Aber masterfully weaves these different types of violence together, suggesting this profound link between individual trauma and the brokenness of society as a whole.
It really makes you wonder if true escape is ever possible when you're carrying so much pain, both personal and inherited. But even with all that darkness, Nyla shows incredible resilience. She slowly becomes more aware of her own agency, her power to choose and shape her own life.
Her journey isn't a straight line, though, and that's what makes it so relatable. She has moments of clarity and empowerment, but then she falls back into old patterns. It feels authentic to the messiness of growing up and finding your way.
It totally is. And her photography becomes this powerful tool for her self-discovery. It's not just a hobby. It's how she reclaims her narrative, how she finds her voice.
And notice how her photography mirrors her own evolution. Her early photos are blurry, unfocused, just like her inner turmoil. But as she finds clarity, her work becomes sharper, more intentional. It's a beautiful visual metaphor for her journey. Yeah, it's like she's literally framing her own world, choosing what to focus on, bringing order to that chaos. And speaking of framing, I think it's really interesting how Berlin itself almost becomes a character in this story. Aber uses the city as so much more than just a setting. It actually shapes Nyla's journey.
Oh, for sure. You've got that stark, concrete landscape of Gropiusstadt, where Nyla feels so trapped and isolated. And then you've got this totally different energy in Berlin's nightlife, where she's searching for escape and connection, but also running into danger and excess.
Think about Gropiusstadt's architecture for a second. Those massive concrete blocks, they were supposed to be this utopian idea, but for Nyla, they represent this almost dystopian kind of confinement because the city itself is mirroring how boxed in she feels, both physically and emotionally.
Right. And then you have these quieter moments, like when she's swimming in the lake with Sitara. Those scenes offer this glimpse of peace, a sense of belonging that she's so desperate for.
Exactly. Berlin becomes this complex reflection of all Nyla's internal struggles. It represents the freedom she wants and the danger she faces. It's this space where she can try to reinvent herself, but the past just keeps coming back.
Like that really intense scene where she runs into those neo-Nazis at Marlowe's place. It just slams home the fact that the violence and hatred her parents fled from are still there, in the world she lives in.
It just completely shatters any idea of safety or escape. It forces Nyla to face the reality that she can't outrun her heritage, no matter how much she tries to fit in or distance herself from it. And it says so much about the ongoing struggle for belonging that so many immigrants deal with, even in places that are supposed to be tolerant.
Absolutely. And it brings us back to that question of identity, doesn't it? Like, no matter how hard Nyla tries to be that good girl to fit into what's expected, there are always going to be people who see her as an outsider, as a threat. It's heartbreaking, but it also shows how important it is to confront racism and xenophobia in all its forms.
We can't just sit back and ignore it. Nyla's story is such a powerful reminder that these issues are everywhere, even in our own communities.
It's a wake-up call for sure, and that's one of the things that makes Good Girl such a timely and important book, I think. It doesn't give you easy answers, but it makes you confront some uncomfortable truths about yourself and about the world.
And it does it all through these really compelling characters and relationships. Nyla's parents, for example, they're flawed, they're complex, they're not just villains or oppressors. They're people who are deeply shaped by their own trauma and displacement. Right.
You can see why they're so protective of Nyla, why they hold on to tradition so tightly. It's their way of trying to preserve their culture, their identity, in a world that often feels hostile and alienating.
And it creates this tragic irony, Their attempts to shield Nyla from harm actually push her further away. It highlights that difficult balance between protecting the people we love and giving them the freedom to find their own way.
It's a struggle everyone deals with, in a way. But for Nyla, it's made even more intense by those cultural and generational divides. So let's talk more about her journey of self-discovery. Even with all the bad decisions and the pain, you get the sense that she's evolving, becoming more aware of her own power to make choices.
What's interesting is that her growth isn't this straight line. She has these moments where she's so clear, so empowered, like when one decides to really pursue photography, but then she slips back into old patterns of self-destruction. It feels very real, very human.
Totally, it's messy, just like life. And her photography becomes this amazing outlet for her, a way to process everything she's going through and find her own voice. It's not just about taking nice pictures. It's about making sense of the chaos around her, seeing her world through her own lens.
Yes. And notice how Aber uses photography as this metaphor for self-discovery. It's all about finding a way to see yourself and the world more clearly. Remember how Nyla's early photos are often blurry or out of focus? They reflect her own confusion, that inner turmoil.
And as she starts to heal, as she finds her sense of self, her photos become sharper, more deliberate. It's such a great visual representation of her internal transformation.
It really is, and it speaks to the power of art, It helps us understand ourselves, our place in the world. It's a way to process trauma, find meaning, and create something beautiful even out of pain.
It makes me think of that quote, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." Nyla's photography becomes her way of telling her story on her own terms. And the fact that she ultimately decides to leave Berlin for London feels really significant.
It's like she's finally breaking free from that cycle of pain and dysfunction that's been holding her back. It doesn't mean all her problems are magically gone, but it shows she's taking a step toward healing and self-acceptance.
Exactly. It reminds you that sometimes you need distance, physically and emotionally, to really understand your own experiences and start fresh.
And it's important to note that Nyla leaving isn't about abandoning her family or her heritage. It's more about recognizing that she needs to create her own space, to find her own identity on her own terms.
That really hits home. It's about having the courage to break free from expectations, even if it means leaving behind everything you know and stepping into the unknown. And for Nyla, that unknown holds the promise of a new beginning, a chance to write her own story without being held back by the past.
And that's what makes Good Girl such a powerful and ultimately hopeful story. It acknowledges the complexity of identity, the lasting impact of trauma, and the challenges of navigating different cultures. But it also offers this glimmer of hope, suggesting that even when things are tough, we have the power to choose our own path, to heal, and to create a better future for ourselves.
Yeah, it really does. It's about finding that strength to break free, even when it means leaving everything behind. And, one thing that really stood out to me in Good Girl was how Aber shows the immigrant experience, especially all those challenges and microaggressions Nyla faces, even in a city like Berlin, which is supposed to be so progressive.
Right. It really opens your eyes from that casual racism she deals with from her classmates to the constant suspicion from, authority figures. Aber shows us all those ways, subtle and not so subtle, that Nyla's Afghan heritage makes her an outsider. She's always being reminded that she doesn't quite belong, no matter how much she tries to fit in.
It's like this constant battle for her. And it's even more complex because she's a woman, right? She's stuck between these two cultures that have totally different ideas about what it means to be a good girl. On one side, there's the pressure to stick to her family's traditional values. And then on the other, there's this pull towards, Western individualism and freedom.
It's a tough balancing act for sure. Nyla's trying to make those two worlds work, to find her own identity in the middle of all these conflicting expectations. Her rebellion, her choices, even those self-destructive behaviors, it's like she's pushing back against all those constraints, trying to find her own voice in all that noise.
Her relationship with Marlowe is a perfect example of that, when you say he's like this symbol of rebellious freedom. But it's ultimately empty and damaging. It's almost like she's attracted to him because he represents everything she's been told she shouldn't be.
That's a really good point. Marlowe's freedom comes from privilege, from not being tied down. He can be reckless and self-indulgent because he doesn't have to face the same consequences that Nyla does. He doesn't answer to her family, her community, her culture. His rebellion is easy. It's a luxury. But for her, it comes at a real cost.
And I think Nyla eventually figures that out, that his version of freedom isn't what she's really looking for. She wants something deeper, something that respects her heritage and lets her connect with her own identity on a deeper level.
And that's where her photography comes in, right? It's not about running away from reality. It's about facing it, documenting it, and turning it into art. When she's behind the lens, she takes control of her story, she finds her voice, and she starts to heal.
It's like she's taking all those broken pieces, the pain, the confusion, even the beauty, and making something whole and meaningful out of them. It's a powerful image of how art can change us.
Totally. It reminds us that to truly understand ourselves and where we fit in, sometimes we need to take a step back, to look at things from a different angle and find new ways to tell our own stories. Nyla's journey shows how strong the human spirit can be, the power of self-discovery, and how important it is to embrace all the different parts of who we are.
It's a great reminder that even though our pasts, our cultures, and our experiences shape our stories, we get to choose how we deal with those influences and write our own endings.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And for everyone listening, I really recommend you check out Good Girl by Aria Aber. It's one of those stories that stays with you long after you finish it. It makes you think about your own journey of self-discovery and how complicated identity can be in a world that's always changing.
It's a book that starts conversations, makes you question things, and in the end, leaves you feeling hopeful. It reminds us that even when things are tough, we can always grow, heal, and find our own unique place in the world.
I totally agree. So what did you all think? What parts of Good Girl resonated with you the most? Were there any moments or characters that really stuck with you? Tell us about your favorite parts in the comments below, and let's keep talking about it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Good Girl, everyone. We hope you enjoyed it and found it thought-provoking. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into those stories that really matter.